You may be aware that episode 40 of the podcast has just gone up today. I've also decided to release episode 41. It's with another author of cool behind-the-scenes movie books, and that's author John Walsh. John and I spoke a couple of weeks ago about his new book, Escape from New York, the official story of the film, the publisher of which was kind enough to send me a copy which I have in front of me here. And I must say I really enjoyed it. It's a film that I didn't really grow up with. It's a film that was recommended to me. I've not been a John Carpenter aficionado like many of my friends, but a friend of mine, Keith Voss, hi Keith, recommended this film some time ago. I hadn't seen The Thing either, believe it or not, until recent years, thanks to Keith and my friend Tony Ellis pushing me to watch it. But they're films I enjoy very much now, and this book chronicles the behind-the-scenes story, all those little nuggets that people like me, and hopefully like you, enjoy. So here's my chat with author John Walsh about his new book, Escape from New York, the official story of the film, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. So John, tell me the kind of moment when you realised you could have more of an active role as a film fan.
Well, for me, it kind of dovetailed with what I was doing as part of my charity work. I'm a filmmaker and I'm a writer for television and film, but I'm also a trustee of the Ray and Diana Harryhausen Foundation. And as we were leading up to the centenary in 2020, we were trying to think of things we could do, kind of raise awareness and profile and so on. And I'd always been interested in doing a book about Ray Harryhausen's unmade films, and there'd been quite a lot of them. And I used to ask him about that when he was around. Sadly, he died in 2013. But when he was around, I used to ask him about Sinbad Goes to Mars and his version of King Kong, and what was this going to be like, and what was that going to be like. And he was kind of reluctant to talk about them in great detail. And having had a few of my own projects, which didn't materialise, it's kind of a bit of a sore point with filmmakers, what didn't happen and what should have happened. And so I had a chat with Vanessa, his daughter, who's also a trustee of the foundation. So there's kind of 3 trustees, we're quite small. And I said, I think we have enough assets to create possibly a book here. And so Titan Books were making Harryhausen the movie posters, which I suggested. And that was really based on the back of the James Bond poster book, which I really love that book. It's great because most people have it in their libraries. It's relatively inexpensive. And although it might seem like it's the same poster with Bond sort of posing in a tuxedo against a background of Bond girls, although we can't say that now, but Bond actresses or actors, I thought the Harryhausen book could be even more interesting because his films are quite varied from kind of classic Arabian adventures to dinosaur epics and so on. So the poster book did quite well, or did very well. And so Titan said to me, look, if you're interested in doing the Lost Films of Ray Harryhausen, or Harryhausen the Lost Movies as it was ended up branded because it's a snappier title. So we did that and it was very successful. I was ready to return back to the world of filmmaking. And Titan Books said to me, so what would you like to do next? And I said, other than sit around and talk about projects I should have had off the ground by now. And they said, no, what are the books? And I said, oh, okay. Well, I don't know if you guys know, it's the 40th anniversary for Flash Gordon in 2020. And have you thought of doing a making of book there? Because, it needs one. And they were like, yeah, we know. And I was like, oh, okay, sorry. I thought that was me telling you something you didn't know. And they said, no, we know, but it can't really be done. We tried doing it at the 35th and at the 30th. And I was like, oh. And I said, well, what's the reason? And they said, the rights to the film character and the rights to the film and the owners for distribution and third-party sales are 3 different parties. And it's not that they don't get on, but it's just that to get them all together, and they'd all have to kind of agree and in unison, in sync, agree to a kind of an IP contract for one project, for one book. So it's always been in the long grass, Jamie, because of that. So I said, well, look, if I can get these folks together, would you like me to write the book? And they said, well, that's what we'd like you to do. We'd like you to do another book for us. So I said, well, look, leave it to me. I'll fix this problem. And so 8 months later, after speaking to the good folks down at Studio Canal, Universal Pictures and King Features, we reached an agreement, and Tyson Books then allowed me to go ahead and write the book. So that came out around this time last year, so around sort of November 2020. But the surprising thing about it was that it had a budget 3 times the size of Star Wars from 1977. So it was around... I spoke to Dino De Laurentiis' wife Martha, who sadly passed just a few days ago, and she gave me some sort of financial details on it, and around $33 to $35 million spent in 1979 for the film that came out in 1980. Wow. So really one of the most expensive science fiction films of all time at that time. If we think Superman the movie came out at $55 million in 1978, but they had mostly shot Superman 2 alongside that. Mm-hmm. So Star Wars around $7 to $11 million, depending on which set of figures you look at. So Flash Gordon, 3 times Star Wars, and you'd expect 3 times as many pictures or photos and behind the scenes stuff. And there was virtually nothing in the studio archives except the usual publicity shots and headshots, as they call them, of the actors and what you might see regularly in TV listings magazines, you know. So I got the shock of my life thinking, oh great, we can write this book. And there was nothing to put in it, because if it's a 200-page book and you're asking people for around £30 or £35, then you need to be able to offer them high quality images and preferably stuff they haven't seen before. So I sort of set to work finding the images and finding the stories behind the images. And of course that led me down this most glorious of rabbit holes, where the BFI had held prisoner since the sort of 1977-78 Nicholas Roeg's work on Flash Gordon that he created for Dino De Laurentiis. Nicholas Roeg then left the project, and it hasn't seen the light of day since. And the BFI don't own that material, or they kind of do. It's kind of like a custody battle amongst children. They were donated, if you like, the physical artwork by Nicholas Roeg's family, and it's held, as it were, in trust for the country. But getting stuff out of the BFI, it's kind of tricky. It's like getting somebody out of a Turkish prison. You know they're there, they want to be freed, but they're not going to play ball, you know. So luckily Studio Canal helped with that and freed the artwork, and it was seen for the first time in the Flash Gordon book. And that kind of set the tone for finding those pictures that really should be out there. The making of, the Hawkmen flying, the model sequences. Basically what you'd find in a Star Wars making of book from the same era. You want those photos. So I spent a lot of time looking for those photos, and they were all in there in the book that came out last year. The book sold like crazy well. I think the first edition sold out in 10 days when it was published in America. The second edition is on its way, and it's got some updated photos, because frustratingly, Jamie, I kind of was finding bits and pieces of what I thought was cinematic gold. Oh, can we pop that one in? Oh, I found something else. And I found better versions or colour versions of those photos. When that was finished, Tyson Books said to me, look, we'd like to do something else with you. And book 3 happened, which is what you're talking to me about today, Escape from New York, the official story of the film. But in the time it's taken us to speak and set up this interview, I've finished book 4, and I've started officially book 5 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, Thursday. So I've suddenly found myself in the book writing game. I've become like a published author. I'm like a Barbara Taylor Bradford, I think. So of the making of book worlds, and that I'm hammering these out. No offence, Barbara Taylor Bradford. Her books are better, I'm sure.
Yeah. So I'm sure it must be quite difficult to sort of remember all the things about the previous books you've done while still having your head in the current book that you're doing as well. But I have to say, having read through the book in the last couple of days, and I have it here with me, I was really impressed with the kind of layout of it and how you take us through the story, because there are photos in there that I've never seen. There are things that I never knew. Some of the stories I'm aware of from making ofs and things like that, but you've obviously gone and done your own interviews yourself, and you've, as you say, you found photos that might not necessarily been out in the public before. Do you still get that buzz each time you find something new?
Yes, it's kind of a sense of euphoria and anxiety. Oh, hang on, if they've got this one, do they have the others? And they've got the colours. Because for Flash Gordon, most of the photography was done in colour, printed in black and white for the press, and then it's the press 8x10s that have been saved by the studios, bizarrely. For Escape from New York, similar situation. A lot of it was printed up in colour, and we have most of the colour ones in the book. But Kim Golteb Walker, who was the unit stills photographer, and she gets a whole chapter in the book, we worked closely together to make sure we had the best representations and really the pictures that tell the story best, because I had to park that part of me that was fanboy and make sure that no, it's the best pictures, not necessarily the most unpublished ones, because there is that balance, isn't there, Jamie, between wanting to present the film as best you can, and you like in a wedding picture, if someone has their eyes closed, the photographer will say, well, let's do that again, everyone say cheese, look this way. So it is that balance of making sure I'm not just putting something in because it hasn't been seen before. And then all the FX stuff hasn't been seen, and Joe Alves' artwork, which he doesn't even have himself, apparently, that's in the book for the first time. So it was really repeating what I did on Flash Gordon, but this film was a much smaller budget, $6 million, and the story itself takes place within one night. So potentially there was, I suppose, a question mark over whether it could be a good making of book. Are the assets out there? And for a publisher, the concern is that, well, we don't really know until John Walsh has written the manuscript and found most of the pictures, and then we'll know. But by that stage, they're already in with the license rights holder, Studio Canal, and I've already kind of disturbed everyone. Hello, can I speak to you? Hello, can you send me this?
The pressure's on, yeah.
So, it's the pressure's on, but it is much like film and TV productions I've done before. You kind of get together the assets you want, your contributors, and you create for yourself a kind of a daily tick list of how much to get done a day. So typically I'll try and write between 750 and 1,000 words a day for the books, and certainly on book 5 I'm doing that. But it's making sure that it's not me. I really remove myself from these books, because as much as I might say in the introduction, when I was a kid and I loved Ray Harryhausen, go to the cinema, and it was an X certificate and I sneaked in. No one really wants my story. They want me to report on the story, which is the making of. And in the case of Flash Gordon especially, a lot of the stories the actors had held on to for years and years weren't the truth. So in a true sort of crime podcast way, I had to find out who were the witnesses, what were their stories, and go back to people and say, I had to go back to Sam Jones and say, that's not Dino's recollection. Can we have another look at that? And so it's important, it would be important to me if this was a documentary for television, because you'd need to make sure that you've done your due diligence around things and make sure that things are appropriate. But things go wrong all the time. How do you put that in a book without making people seem or appear incompetent, and therefore have probably a claim to come back and say, actually, you shouldn't have said that because you've talked about what I got wrong and not what I got right, and so on. So the balance between discussing how difficult it is to achieve something, but without pulling people down, I think is sometimes a bit of a tightrope.
Yeah, and I find that very interesting, that idea of taking people's words from back in the day, but also having up-to-date interviews with them as well, because you see these interviews with the stars and the main players over the years, and you can see it's almost like a comedian kind of honing their performance. They've got their stories and they're going to stick to them, whether they're true or not sometimes. So yeah, I can understand that you're a bit of a kind of a forensic expert in a way, trying to dig through all of the things that may not be factual, trying to find the truth and trying to satisfy everyone. But what was it about this film in particular, Escape from New York, that you were attracted to, other than the fact that the anniversary was coming? Is it a film that you've always loved?
Yes, it's been one of those films that it's one of those VHS films that I always had and always played, and if it came out on a new format on widescreen in VHS, I was there. The DVD, the Blu-ray, the 4K, and I dare say if you could inject it into my brain as a tiny little crystal so I could live inside of New York 1997, I would. I was always interested, and still am, in science fiction. And John Carpenter did lots of science fiction films. And this is science fiction, It's as much science fiction as other films from that era, like Soylent Green, Logan's Run. But the combination of the music and the styling of it is uniquely John Carpenter. When you flick it on, you get a sense of a John Carpenter film, and it's aged particularly well. If we think of the other films that came out in 1981 that were big hits, there was Dragon Slayer, Clash of the Titans, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and of course, Escape from New York. This received a 4K remaster before any of those films did. And in the case of Dragon Slayer, that hasn't even had a Blu-ray release. So I think the film's kind of unique styling, special effects and music, no other film from a major studio did anything quite like that at that time. And I think that's helped with the longevity of it. And people are looking back now at John Carpenter. He's received better now than he was then, much like Ray Harryhausen. You know, when John Carpenter's films came out, they did make a little bit of a noise saying the new film from John Carpenter. But mostly people went because they wanted to see it and not because it was John Carpenter. And of course it marks the moment at which the point of no return. He didn't have a successful project after this. And as I can hear people screaming down the Twitter, hashtag cancel John Walsh. There's so many John Walshes out there, they'll cancel the wrong one probably and not this one. But it's true. This was his last successful film.
Yeah, it was pretty good, wasn't it? I mean, a $5-6 million budget, made about 25 million, I think. So, I mean, that's a pretty good return. A very low budget film. But where does this kind of fit in terms of budgets at the time for 1981?
Actually, it fits quite well. Clash of the Titans, 15 million pounds. Not dollars, but pounds. And that was the most expensive Ray Harryhausen film. And it's a big epic, Cleopatra-style epic with stop-motion monsters. You know, effectively that's the tagline for that, potentially for budgeteers. So it kind of fits in the medium area. So films like Death Wish would have been shot for a fraction of that, and this kind of alludes to a lot of those stylings. Raiders of the Lost Ark, which would have been around $20 million. So $6 million is pretty substantial. It was 6 times more than John had on his previous film, The Fog, which was also a great success. So for him, it was a decent budget. It wasn't low budget. And certainly for the studio, for the marketing, they spent about $6 million on the marketing as well, which was quite unusual at the time. There were so many different sort of marketing materials and so on that you will have seen in the book. So we think of it now in terms of low budget. Some aspects of the film were even low budget for the time. So if we look at the visual effects, so the glider flying across New York with all the lights off, you know, and there'd be people who thinking, well, they obviously got shots of New York in the evening when people turn all the lights off. It's like, that doesn't really happen. So they went to different effects houses. They started with John Dykstra at Apogee, who had been working on the Star Wars films, and he quoted $3 million for the effects shoot and $1 million for himself to coordinate the sequences, which was kind of standard fees for him at the time. But they ended up going to Roger Corman at New World and did the whole thing for around $350,000 with Robert and Dennis Shotak and the team down there, who'd just done Battle Beyond the Stars. So they'd really kind of cut their teeth on a lower budget Star Wars. So this was no real stretch for them in a sense, but it was in terms of creativity, trying to get something that worked. Of course, the interesting thing about this film, from a technical point of view, is that they were working at very low light levels with HMI lights, and yes, it wasn't a very grainy image. So there was a little bit of a technical turning point with this film. And I think that's added to its longevity. You know, some films from the 70s don't scan as well in 4K. I was going to throw some examples out there since I might be getting cancelled anyway. Let's throw some out there. So like The French Connection 1 and 2, or The Exorcist, and certainly John Schlesinger's films Midnight Cowboy and Marathon Man, deliberately shooting at low light levels with very fast stocks and some kind of fast lenses. But the result of that is you get a swarm of grain on the film, which, you know, cinephiles love that kind of thing. Other purists for HD picture think that's an error and needs to be corrected or smoothed out. I don't have a view either way. I mean, it's the nature of film, but this is the turning point. You know, the 4K for Escape from New York didn't need lots of digital tinkering. That is the image that was on the camera neg, which was great. They found the camera negative, which is an unusual thing to find these days.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and you talk about as well how they did adopt that new technology with the faster lenses and the faster stock, and also the Panavision camera, you know, the CinemaScope as well, to add some sort of grandeur to what were essentially relatively cheap sets at the time, with Joe Alves working his best. I mean, what a coup to get Joe Alves, you know, just coming off the back of two of the biggest movies in history, Jaws and Close Encounters. What do you think Joe Alves' impact was on this movie?
Well, I think for Joe Alves, it was a kind of a relearning of what he had learned. So Close Encounters and Jaws were both big studio pictures that had big budgets, and particularly Close Encounters, a beautiful, sumptuous film that really he was able to show off his skills. Here, Escape from New York, tight budget, tight schedule, thinking on their feet. They could only build what they could film, and in some cases, they filmed things they could not build. So you see the light drop off into black quite suddenly on the rooftop of the World Trade Center, which was shot on the flat ground of Indian dunes, and night time can be your friend. So there's no day for night in this film. So Joe Alves and other people were able to hide within the shadows, because if you can't afford for the street to go on and on and on and on, well, you can put a few pin lights at different scales down to suggest that the bridge is longer than it is. Sound can suggest a lot more. We can have helicopters left and right. So I think for Joe Alves, he had to kind of really think on his feet. And for him, it was less about creating a collegiate look and feel, as you would say in Blade Runner or in Logan's Run, but just making sure it's credible and works for the money. So I think he found it tough, and I think he was glad to return to higher budgets, but it was certainly a great crash course in how films were being made in the 70s and would continue to be made in the 80s.
Yeah, I've spoken to Joe actually. Unfortunately, we didn't get around to talking about this particular film. We spoke about Jaws and Close Encounters and that huge set for Close Encounters. So I can imagine it was a bit of a step down, and as you say, getting him thinking on his feet probably like earlier on in his career. This film always kind of borders on comedy for me. I mean, I'm sure that there's an intention there, but also we buy into the reality, don't we? Because of all of these aspects that we've just talked about. How do you think Carpenter's influences that, and how does he manage to pull that off?
Well, I think initially the script that John had written based on the Watergate scandal and about the corruption of power at the very height of government, although as I've said to some people, Richard Nixon doesn't seem that bad now. Doesn't seem that bad at all. I mean, he was not to go off on a tangent, and I'm not a Republican, but not that bad. And the character of the president that we see in Donald Pleasance owes a lot to Richard Nixon. And although Richard Nixon wasn't a self-serving man, he actually was quite a diligent, hard-working politician. And there's that phrase, only Nixon could go to China. He achieved lots, but not to take away from him the scandal. It was his. He owned it. So when Bob Remy at Avco Embassy wanted to do Escape from New York, they brought in somebody else. They brought in Nick Castle, who of course played the Shape in Halloween, and to inject some sort of humour into the film so that it wasn't too unrelenting. So I think there is kind of knowing winks to other genres there. The whole thing of when people meet Snake, I thought you were dead. People say that a lot to him. Everyone says that to him. It's almost as if it's the password to speaking to him. You have to say, oh, I thought you were dead. So that becomes a bit of a running joke. And also, there are great scenes of humour in the film. The laugh out loud moment for me is when Isaac Hayes, as the Duke of New York, barracks the president and says, I can't hear you. You're the Duke of New York. You're A#1. And he makes him say that. At the end, then, when he fills him full of lead from the height of the wall, that's kind of a laugh out loud moment. There's a balance between what works as comedy and what works as horror. And I think in The Thing as well, there are great sequences when all of the men are tied up and they're testing all the blood, and they've tested one and it's fine, they've tested another, and they're kind of like, can you untie me from the chair, because I think...
Yeah.
And so there's great humour to be found in the tension, and I think that's one of the keys to John Carpenter's success, because of course we look at the effects and what Rob Bottin did in The Thing and so on, but actually it is that camaraderie and the believability. When you get actors who are believable in an unbelievable setting, it can sometimes fall apart. And I mean, I've seen some recent fantasy films that involve, whether it's people trying to do a Harry Potter or something like that, and there's recent ones on at the moment, and they just fall apart from the opening title sequence. The minute someone opens their gob, it's kind of like, oh, this doesn't work, and this is not landing well at all. and you kind of sit through it for maybe the hour and a half, and it just doesn't quite work. And it's something people must be aware of when they see rushes, but that's way too late. Once the rushes are coming in and you're all sat there looking at dailies, it's kind of like, so luckily it's never happened on anything I've worked on, but there have been moments for John. His films have been sort of 50%, actually it's probably more like 35% successful and the rest unsuccessful. So he hasn't always got it right at the time with audiences, but people have come back. They Live is a great film. It was dismissed at the time. Prince of Darkness. I even like Memoirs of an Invisible Man with Chevy Chase. I think that's a great film, and it's not a comedy. That's really kind of a thriller, and Chase brings some humour to it. But it's difficult. I think it's been difficult for John because it's to have success and then not to fully share in it, but to have failure and to be fully blamed for it. It's it's the director's lot, I'm afraid.
Yeah, you talk about Kurt Russell's kind of career as well, in as much as this was a big moment for his career and his success, and that he couldn't have had his career without this film, and he speaks quite affectionately about it, doesn't he?
He does, yes. I mean, I think Kurt realises he sort of had three careers. He had the sort of Macaulay Culkin career where he was a child actor and a very successful one on the various Walt Disney films, and he was superbly talented. To make that break then to becoming a teenager and an adult actor, and particularly the 1978 film Elvis for television, was it 1979, where John Carpenter directed Kurt Russell playing Elvis Presley. I think that really was the turning point. Both men met, they worked professionally, it was very successful, and that's the point in which Kurt Russell was reinvented, because it could quite easily have been another actor from the time. Could have been Ryan O'Neal, it could have been Richard Gere, it was nearly Charles Bronson.
Yeah, I was quite alarmed at that idea when I read that.
But I think if it was Charles Bronson, 40 years later I'd still be writing this book, and I'd be saying how interesting for John Carpenter to work with Charles Bronson, and they might have gone on to have done The Thing together, and Charles Bronson in Big Trouble in Little China.
Yeah.
It still would have been good films, but it's kind of, yes, it's hard to imagine.
It is a great cast though, isn't it? You've got some sort of veteran actors in there, I guess, in Ernest Borgnine, and you've got Donald Pleasance, and where were those? And you kind of profile those in the book as well. But for the listeners, and hopefully for the future readers of this book, just describe for me where those actors were in their careers and kind of how they fit into this puzzle.
So you have Isaac Hayes, who was a successful musician and had won an Oscar for his score on Shaft. He was kind of a really unusual choice to play that key role of the Duke of New York, but much more traditional choices. You have Academy Award winner Ernest Borgnine, who won his Academy Award for Marcy, but I know from the Poseidon Adventure and the Black Hole. I love the Black Hole. That's great. Had I been on set with him, I would have nagged him about questions about the Black Hole, about the Vincent robots, about old Bob. And then you have Harry Dean Stanton and Adrienne Barbeau, and of course the great Donald Pleasance. You have actors who will always agree to a job if the money is right, and that's not to throw shade on any of the great people involved. One of the I won't say compromises, but one of the assurances that John Carpenter gave to Avco Embassy was to employ people who were supremely professional in those roles. You didn't need to necessarily direct Ernest Borgnine or Harry Dean Stanton or Donald Pleasance, because they brought a certain amount of skill and expertise. So I think that's the trade-off. I've got the unknown Kurt Russell playing the lead and carrying this picture, doing an impersonation almost of Clint Eastwood, but I will populate it with people that audiences will be familiar with and comfortable with. If Kojak could have been in there, Telly Savalas, you could have had Sean Connery, These were the actors who were affordable on that scale price. Donald Pleasance said no initially because he was worried about taking on the American accent again and playing a very American role of an American president. And how he rationalised it in his own mind, Donald Pleasance, was that he was the offspring child of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And I kind of feel that there's a deleted scene at the beginning of the film that's on the DVD of a bank robbery, which shows why Snake was arrested. I would have preferred a scene set around the White House and boarding Air Force One, and you get a real sense of really maybe how unpleasant the president was. That would have been nice. That would have set up the drama, I think, for me. But those actors were available at the time, and as anyone who's booked actors who are slightly well known will know, you set your shooting schedule around people's availability, whether that's a DOP or a sound recordist that you want, and so on. So luckily these actors were available. Others were available that were nearly cast. Warren Oates was nearly cast as Brain for Harry Dean Stanton, and he had to pull out because of heart problems. He died the following year. He was also cast as Dr. Zarkov in Flash Gordon, and when he couldn't take that role for the same reason, Topol was cast and made it very much his own in Flash Gordon. So I think that sort of casting helps viewers, because the film was an X certificate and it was quite violent, unexpectedly violent for what people might have normally expected from this type of thriller. Then it just gave some comfort to the film company and distributors that, oh no, it's familiar faces too. It's not all the young people running off with all the equipment and casting their friends. So it felt like it had one foot in traditional thrillers. And of course Donald Pleasance was perfect for me, because he played Dr. Loomis, of course, in Halloween, and I contacted him when I was a film student, asked him to be in one of my films rather cheekily.
Oh, really?
And I got this really sweet letter back saying that no, I live on the Virgin Islands now as a tax exile, and it's because of being in Halloween.
Right.
He earned so much money from that and the other pictures that he couldn't afford to be back in the UK, where it was very expensive in the 70s and early 80s if you had lots of money and you weren't a limited company.
You mentioned there about that deleted scene, the opening scene. And I've also heard Kurt Russell talk about how what he loves about the movie is that he read it and he made it and he saw it, and it's the film he read and it's the film he made, and that's what you get with John Carpenter. But did you come across much in terms of what was deleted and what could have been? Yes, I mean there's sort of sequences that were extended. There weren't kind of wholesale deletions, and there were things that were added as well. When Maggie's character is killed on the bridge, they needed to go back and do an insert shot showing her dead with her eyes opened. But no, it's quite economic. It's rare for films to have many deleted scenes. Normally a scene is deleted because either it doesn't quite work or because it's overrunning and they can't afford to finish it. There are sequences and I think there's photos in the book, I should remember, of I think some Native Americans chasing Snake outside of the World Trade Center. Mm-hmm. So there's a scene there. The trims for that haven't been found. So there's a work print that was found and cleaned that shows the bank robbery sequence, but the other neg trims have been thrown away. I've been looking for neg trims for a long time for old films, particularly at the Harryhausen Foundation. And when I speak to the folks down at Columbia Pictures and the Sony Archive, they'll say to me that if it's pre-1977, there'll be no trims, and they will have been recycled, which is another word for thrown out. Thrown away, yeah, thrown away. So filmmakers sometimes keep neg trims. I've kept loads of neg trims. No one wants them. No one's come knocking yet for my neg trims. It's not standard practice. And of course, you might have a neg trim, but they'll be mute. There'll be no sound with them. But I think now people would like to see something if it's there, and it's a shame that they're probably not there. I'm not convinced in this case that the neg trims don't exist, but they may be in cans that are not labelled with the production name. Unless you put them across a light box wearing a pair of Mickey Mouse white cotton gloves, then you're not going to know what it is just from sight alone. So it's a bit like when Doctor Who episodes have been found. There are certain Doctor Who fans who could put it up to the light and just look at one frame and tell you what episode and what story it is. And I'm one of those people. It's like, name that tune. I'll name that tune in one frame. So those sorts of people need to be let loose in archives, and maybe they could attach chains to them so they can't leave, and there's just enough food and they can go and scurry around. Pat with the them down box on the way in and out. Yeah. Absolutely. Or don't let them leave, just leave them in there chained up, and they can fend for themselves. Happy to live their lives out. I would indeed. So all I want is a light box, some food and water, and I'll be happy. I could be in there for years finding the trims for films. There's Flash Gordon trims that we think are in Paris, the Studio Canal archive. Right. And I've had a chat with the lads at Canal about that, because they didn't think there were the deleted scenes that I described in the book
then I found the photos of the scenes, and they were like, oh,
right.
well, if you've got photos of people in full costume on set, which I had, they said then they probably did film it.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It's always this. It is like an old cold case that you're going into. People have the locked final film and sound. Everything else outside it has just literally disappeared, and there's no interest until more recent years of finding that material. There's been no monetary value in it. I think the first Rocky film has a deleted scene where the sound is missing. I'm not sure if it is ever reinstated, and I think it's Rocky and Adrian in the car park discussing what had happened. And I remember Stallone saying during one of the re-releases of the film that the sound no longer exists for that. But I always thought because the actors are still around, they could loop that dialogue in. And when I think when Spartacus was reissued and they had a great scene with Laurence Olivier and Tony Curtis in a bath. Don't worry, I'll keep it PG. And they were talking about snails and oysters.
Yeah.
I promise, it's still PG. They had Anthony Hopkins came and did the voice for Sir Laurence Olivier, and I think Tony Curtis himself came back and redid his voice on that. So it's doable, it's possible.
It is quite tantalising, that idea, isn't it? That they're sat in a can. These trims are sat in a can somewhere with the wrong label on. I know I spoke to a guy called Kenneth George Godwin who was there for David Lynch's Dune down in Mexico, and he shot all the behind-the-scenes material, which then De Laurentiis binned because he didn't want anything being shown about the production of that particular movie. Now, I've lived in hope for, I don't know, some 20 years that those behind-the-scenes bits of footage that were shot on videotape at the time are still around somewhere. But as you say, unless there's like a financial reason for it, or I don't know, somebody invests some money in some way, that they're just not going to be found, because who's going to spend the time going through one thing after another and knowing exactly what they're looking for, especially when it's for behind the scenes material as well, because you can't immediately go like your Doctor Who fan self, oh, that wasn't in the movie, because you don't know, because there is some behind the scenes material of that film out there, but not much. But no, I'm recognizing a kinship here, and as much as we both love to dig into these things and find things that haven't been seen before. So what is the next project for you, John?
Well, the next project is book 4 that I'm not allowed to talk about. So that's finished. That was delivered and signed off by the licensor a couple of weeks ago. And as I talk to you now, I'm kind of 3 or 4 weeks into book 5. And I said earlier I was like Barbara Taylor Bradford. I'm much more like Dame Barbara Cartland, because she really
just
did
knocking
get
them
through
out.
them. And she used to lie on it. I mean, I need to get myself like a lovely, not chiffon blouse, but maybe a chaise longue and an assistant with a notepad, and I'll just chat about the various lost films and what I think, and they can just write it down. We could do one a week.
Have you got a list then going forward? Have you got a list either in your mind or on paper somewhere or on your computer somewhere of the films that you'd like to tackle in this vein?
I think so, yes. I mean, I've discussed with the publisher possible titles, and they've told me sort of off the record what's allowed and what isn't, which studios kind of play ball and which ones don't. And so suddenly a big chunk of your list gets redacted because, oh, well, they're out of the frame. The stuff at the Harryhausen Foundation that I'm interested in covering as well. The next 2 books I'm doing are specific single film books, so they are about particular individual films. But yeah, I think you have to be invested in it. If somebody wanted me to do a book about a film that I wasn't interested in, as much as I'd consider the offer and I'd be flattered, I'm one of those spoilt filmmakers because I've never worked for anyone else. When I left film school, I started getting my own commissions, and that was it. And I've been doing it the same way ever since. So the idea of working on something, I'm not a big fan of sports. So if somebody wanted me to do a book about sports, I'd find that quite a challenge. Yeah. It'd have to be a lot of money to do that. And even then, I wouldn't bring the best of myself to it. So there'd be somebody else out there who'd be a bigger fan of that. But with this and the other books, you can't be too big a fanboy either. So you do have to detach yourself and think, well, look, you're the lead in the picture, but I need to go back and speak to you again about what you're claiming you co-directed this sequence, or you came up with the idea for the ending, because it's not actually true. So we're going to have to rework this and find the answers here between us, because I think if I was a total fanboy, I would just verbatim take down everything that was said, pop it into the book, And then people would read it and say, there's a lot of contradictory stuff in here. So I think it's kind of key to have an interest in the film. But then the assets have to be out there. And then there's some films I like that would never make it as a book. I'm a big fan of Santa Claus the movie, for example. I think there's a lot to be said for that film. It's the people who made Superman. It was at the time one of the most expensive films in cinema history. And of course it landed unsuccessfully, and there's a lot wrong with that film as well. I mean, we could sit here for hours talking about what's wrong with it, but I would buy that book if somebody wrote the making of it, because I'd be fascinated to see what Derek Meddings was doing, the flying sequences and everything else. But it is a case of, can you make a successful book from an unsuccessful film? And I think that's true, and I think Titan Books have done that. Labyrinth was a commercial and critical failure. Hard to imagine that now, as was The Dark Crystal when it first came out. And they're two of the best-selling books that Titan make as making of titles. So this reappraisal of films from the past doesn't necessarily have to be films that were successful. We can look again at films that were unsuccessful. And, Blade Runner is a great example of that.
Yeah.
Blade Runner was a commercial and critical failure. And people like to think it wasn't. And it was. It clearly was, and it was a long time before it paid for itself.
Yeah, and Paul Salmon's book sold like hotcakes. I mean, it's now one of the most revered films of all time, isn't it? Do you feel a sort of a need, an imperative to kind of get these stories down? Because, we're talking about films that are 40, 50 years old here. Sooner or later, nobody that was engaged on the film are going to be around anymore.
Yeah, with Flash Gordon, sadly Dino De Laurentiis isn't around anymore, but there was people in his family, his wife, who was able to share with me, but sadly she passed, as we say, a few days ago. Mike Hodges, when he wrote the foreword, I'd known Mike before because we're both members of the Directors Guild, but I didn't know him well. We'd never worked together. Directors never work with each other, so when they go to the guild meetings, everyone can be like really nice and have coffee and tea, because no one's ever going to work with anyone, and if they do, something's gone very wrong. So we got on really well, but he said to me, "It's great you're doing this, because it's a form of recorded history." Because he said, soon most of the people on the picture will be gone. Max von Sydow died as I was writing the book, and we had an interview with him lined up. So yes, I mean, I think it is much more, since I've been a trustee of the Harryhausen Foundation, I recognise that we're preserving this work not just for ourselves and for commercial exploitation, but because if we don't, there will be nothing in 20 years' time except the films and sound that are locked. Where are the support materials? Where are the stories about how it was done and who did it? And to have a vague idea of how things were done is not the same as knowing how things were done. If we take the example of Fritz Lang's Metropolis, we can recreate those effects now, but it's still not entirely clear how he did those effects at the time. And it wasn't all double exposures and so on. There was a lot more going on. So I think, yes, I think there is an imperative in making sure that films are remembered and their history is fully recorded. And these DVD extras now that come out in those big, you see the big box sets, they're like house bricks, aren't they? Yeah. That, especially down at Studio Canal, they do great ones. And a few years ago, the marketplace was saying there's no place for physical media. Supermarkets won't be selling CDs and DVDs, which is true now. They sell them less and less. But there is a bigger market for collector's editions, new information, bundling it with the soundtrack, and so on and so on. So I think as we sort of move forward, certain films will be canonized to some extent, and there'll be a lot maybe that are going to be left behind. I mean, there's a lot of rubbish out there as well. A film shouldn't necessarily be restored and kept just for the sake of it. I was in film school, and I was using The Doors, the Oliver Stone film, as junk spacing when I was doing sound editing, because it was cheaper to use a print of The Doors than it was to pay for expensive junk spacing, which was rather expensive blue spacing to put between your zonal mag tracks. So yeah, I was cutting in a print of The Doors, which would have otherwise seen the bottom of a bin. So there is a disposability around films, around the sets, the costumes, the models. That's why you see at Prop Store, when they have a sale on for something, people are always surprised because up close it's not really a polished Darth Vader helmet. It'll be something maybe that's had lots of layers of gloss paint on it or something, because it'll work for the camera, but to your eye up close you'll think, that can't be the original, can it? So it is that sense of disposability. You know, you wouldn't have kept a packet of cornflakes from 10 or 20 years ago. So film companies are the same with posters, with the original artwork for posters, the trims. Look, I know major TV companies and broadcasters who got rid of their archives of film and tape so they could have more office space.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, really? Or to give people bigger offices because executives came with their egos and they wanted a corner view, and so it pushed everyone out, and so the library is always the thing at the edges. And if a program hasn't been relicensed for a couple of years, you may as well throw it away because we'll have to renegotiate with equity anyway. Just throw it away. No one's going to know. And there's no record of who's done it or who's asked for the tapes to be thrown away. So I think it is important. You know, it's part of our cultural history. If the planet was ever destroyed with a virus-like invasion of the body snatchers, 1978, that would be my preferred virus, by the way. If anyone's looking for a sequel to Omicron or anything else, 1978 Philip Kaufman's virus, I think that's the way we should go. There'll be a lot of screaming, but and a lot of kind of messy pod stuff, but it'll be much more exciting than the way we're heading. You'd want those pod people to know this is what cinema was.
Yeah, and that's what I like about these books that you've made as well, is that they're artifacts, aren't they? You know, we might have the film on Blu-ray or DVD, and we might have the extras where we hear some of the similar quotes, but having something that you can kind of pore over at your own pace, and you can kind of edit, flipping from one page to the next if you so wish, or reading it through in the narrative form that you put it down in. I think these sit really well side by side with those box sets because they're companion pieces, but they give us the chance to kind of really, you know, consider the photo. You know, you might, in a documentary, you might have a photo flash up for 5 seconds. In this, I can look at it for as long as I want. You know, there are things I've noticed in books of this ilk that I've never noticed looking at documentaries and looking at the films themselves. So, no, I think what you do, John, is great work, and I wish you all the best. So where can people find out about you, your films, your books, and everything else?
Well, if you Google John Walsh filmmaker, that's me. It comes up. So you can find my Twitter there, @WalshBros. You can find my website, walshbros.co.uk, or johnwalshfilmmaker.com. I'm everywhere. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. If I had a proper job, I wouldn't be doing so much socials. But I don't. So I write books.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this little bonus episode, me speaking with John Walsh there. John has definitely got more books in the pipeline, as you heard. It'd be interesting to see what they are, and yeah, he's willing to come back on again and chat about those in the future. Thanks as always for your support. Patreon.com/Jamie Benning if you would like to join the now 81 people that are now contributing to helping support this podcast. I really do appreciate all of your help, everyone. I've just done my interview with Jodorowsky's Dune director Frank Pavich. Frank and I have become quite friendly over WhatsApp recently. We've been having a good chat, and we decided to record another episode following my episode with Sobi and Frank and Dan Lanigan. We didn't really get much of a chance to talk about Jodorowsky's Dune, and it's a film that I've loved for many, many years since it first came out. So that will be an episode in January 2022. So have a wonderful Christmas. A Happy New Year when it comes. I'll still be on Twitter waffling on about all things film @JamieSWB. So until the next episode, have a great break, and I'll see you in the new year.